Welcome back to the podcast. In the last episode, we met the fierce rulers Ahuitzotl, Moctezuma the Elder, and Xocoyotzin. These rulers ended the Mexica dependency on the Tepanec people as Ahuitzotl faced off against Mashla of Coyoacán. Moctezuma expanded the empire to the south and west in numerous wars of conquest, and Xocoyotzin continued the expansion of the empire but faced several challenges in the Mexica Civil War against Tlatelolco and the reign-defining defeat in Michoacán. By now, Tlatelolco, who had served as a captain, general, and advisor to 3 tlatoque, was an old man, but his influence wasn't done. Tizoc, the 7th tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Following the 80 days of funeral ceremonies for Xocoyotzin, the 2 remaining leaders of the Triple Alliance, Netzahualpili of Texcoco and Chimalpopoca of Tlacopan, met with the Mexica high priest and advisor Tlacaelel. They selected Tizoc to be the next tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Tlacaelel, in part, chose his grandnephew Tizoc out of loyalty to his dead brother Moctezuma the Elder. Tizoc was born around 1449, grandson of former emperors Moctezuma the Elder and Ahuitzotl, and the middle brother of 3 who would follow each other as tlatoani: Xocoyotzin, Tizoc, and Ahuitzotl. In the entire 5 years and few days of Tizocicatzin's rule, nothing of note occurred. Alva Ixtlil Xochitl wrote in the History of the Chichimeca Nation. This is a bit of an oversimplification, as ruling an empire is certainly not nothing. Tizoc did hold the empire's borders and conquered some lands within. Having an uneventful reign isn't the worst thing a ruler could be known for. However, Duran noted Tizoc was thought of as cowardly and slow to act. There was frustration from elders that Tizoc was not accomplishing some of the things that had been set out for him, notably completing the Templo Mayor expansion. According to the Catholic writer Duran, Tizoc was a child when he became tlatoani, and Tlacaelel was essentially the de facto ruler. Tizoc's inaugural war to claim captives for his festivities would be against Tenochtitlan. Duran states that the Mexica army lost 300 men and only claimed 40 captives, considered a disaster. This would presumably be seen as an omen, or was written retroactively to fill out the sense of Tizoc's reign. Tizoc was honored with 4 days of festivities. Rulers from around the valley came to honor him. A mushroom dinner was held, and people became drunk on the effects. One of the few monuments bearing his image, called the Tizoc Stone, appears to have been carved to commemorate or elevate his short reign. The Tizoc Stone, now housed in the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, is a circular stone about 3 feet tall. The stone is circled by ornate carvings depicting gods and the feats of Tizoc. Found in 1791 during the building of the Zócalo in Mexico City, it was likely a Temalacatl, a sacrificial platform where an enemy warrior was tied and forced to fight against Aztec warriors. His ritualistic death would be a sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli. The Florentine Codex credits Tizoc with beautifying Tenochtitlan and founding Tuxpan on the Gulf Coast. Additionally, he is credited with victories over the Huastecs, a favorite target of the Mexica. After 5 years, around 1486, Tizoc died. It is possible he was killed by internal forces, as speculation includes theories that he died either by poisoning or maybe natural illness. Duran indicates Tlacaelel did away with him after widespread frustration with his unenthusiastic efforts on the Templo expansion. The Crónica Mexica simply skips from his inaugural festivities to his death. He was cremated and buried at the foot of the Templo to Huitzilopochtli. Tizoc did have military victories in and around the existing Triple Alliance borders, including in Ecatepec and along the Gulf Coast. Ahuitzotl, the 8th tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Upon the death of Tizoc, the lords met, and Tlacaelel began to advocate for his young grandnephew Ahuitzotl, a child at the time, according to Duran. Other sources say he was already an accomplished military leader and priest. Around 1486, Ahuitzotl was chosen to be the 8th tlatoani of Tenochtitlan and tlatoani of the Triple Alliance, overseeing an empire that stretched across the Valley of Mexico to the mountains in the west and to the Gulf of Mexico on the east. Ahuizotl's first effort was his inaugural campaign to put down a rebellion in the coastal region in northern Veracruz, where the Aztec nation was testing the new king. Recently subjugated by his brother Tizoc, Ahuitzotl led the army to victory and returned to Tenochtitlan with captives for his coronation festivities. A huge coronation festival was thrown with allies and enemies both invited, lasting several days. The festivities were attended by the leaders of the Triple Alliance and other city-states. Sacrifices were made, feasts were held, and dancers danced. Pacific Coast Wars of Oaxaca and Tehuantepec. Known for his proficiency as a commander in battle, Ahuitzotl moved south to Tehuantepec on the Pacific coast and further down almost to the modern border of Guatemala. Ahuitzotl enjoyed easy victories in Oaxaca and Tehuantepec, personally leading the mixed forces of the Triple Alliance. Other towns willingly offered their subjugation. The young king returned to Tenochtitlan to a hero's welcome. Later in his rule, he would send the armies to Oaxaca again to quell the people. The Great Temple Expansion. One project linked to Ahuitzotl's reign is the sixth expansion of the Templo Mayor, completed in December of 1487. According to History of the Indies, when Ahuitzotl declared that he would improve and expand the Great Temple, his uncle and chief advisor Tlacaelel cried with joy. It's been hinted that the previous ruler, Tizoc, was murdered in part for his lack of enthusiasm to push the Templo project. Once work resumed under Ahuitzotl, laborers came from across the empire to construct the massive earthwork project. Various materials were brought from the cities best suited to produce them. Once the temple was finished, Ahuitzotl called for a great celebration and all the cities of the empire were invited. The young king invited both allies and enemies alike to participate in the opening ceremonies. Envoys were sent to Tenochtitlan, each bringing gifts and slaves for sacrifice on the new temple. According to one Catholic account, there were 80,000 sacrifices made over 4 days. This number is impossibly high. However, it describes 4 columns of sacrifices leading up to the top of the temple, and that there was so much blood that the city reeked of death. Additional improvements made by Ahuitzotl included a wall around the sacred precinct and building of the Temple of the Eagle Warriors. Around this time, Tlacaelel, the legendary advisor of Mexica lords since he spent his youth running alongside Ahuitzotl, died in 1487. According to legend, he was 120 years old, but probably actually around 90 when he died. He had created the role of Cihuacuatl, or High Advisor, essentially just by being himself. His son, Tlatoque, was appointed as the second Cihuacuatl and would serve Ahuitzotl and Moctezuma the Younger. The Anales de Mexico lists several natural disasters, but I didn't catch these mentioned in other texts. It lists an earthquake in 1489. In 1490, heavy hail killed fish and animals. And then in 1491, a grasshopper infestation that claimed crops. And the Annales lists another earthquake in 1496. The Aquaquexco Aqueduct. As part of his efforts to improve the city, Ahuitzotl commissioned a new aqueduct from the Aquaquexco Spring in Coyoacan. King Cuauhtémoc of Coyoacan issued a gracious warning about the spring, advising the Tenochtitlan leader of potential flooding danger with the project. Displeased with the negativity and warning, Ahuitzotl had King Cuauhtémoc killed, and then he moved forward with the aqueduct project. The assassination proved to be unpopular across the empire. On the day of the aqueduct opening, there was a great pomp as priests dressed as the rain god Tlaloc and Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of fresh and flowing water. With great drumming and throwing of idols and gifts, the Aquaquexco spring was opened and water gushed forth as the priests danced and sang. Children were tortured so their tears could be extracted for Tlaloc, then sacrificed. Soon, the water began to back up within the dams and channels. Then it began to overflow the walls and canals until the chinampas and streets flooded. The flood damage was so bad, according to Duran, that much of the population fled the city. Ahuitzotl sought the help of Nezahualpilli of Texcoco, who gave him a big old told you so for disregarding the warnings of King Tzutzumazin. But he offered divers to go and seal the spring. So, according to the Mexican Chronicle, the divers sacrificed children below the surface of the water. Priests again came to throw statues and sacrifices into the spring, and the water stopped flowing. The history of the Chichimeca nation states that Ahuitzotl was in his garden when the flood reached him. In fleeing, he hit his head on a doorway, causing him a lingering wound. The writer claims this injury eventually killed Ahuitzotl despite attempts to save him, even removing parts of his skull. Other versions simply have him surviving the incident, but with deep guilt and shame for his decision to ignore King Tsutsumazin's warnings, and having him assassinated for his good advice. Duran and the Chronica Mexica say that Ahuitzotl survived the flood and went on to improve the city, providing food and material goods to entice people back to Tenochtitlan, as well as a return campaign to Oaxaca to quell the locals. Ahuitzotl became ill, quickly emaciating until he died, according to Duran. The Chronica doesn't specify how he died, but says he carried deep shame for the Aquaquesco aqueduct catastrophe. One of his final acts was to commission a statue of Tlatoque, the flayed god of agriculture. He saw it in person and was pleased. Whether he was killed as a direct result of the flood or of some unrelated illness is a mystery. Ahuitzotl was honored with great celebration and ritual. His reign saw the expansion of the Templo Mayor and the sacred precinct, and expansion of the empire along the Gulf of Mexico and Pacific coast. Following the funeral celebrations, Tlatoani of Tlacopan and Nezahualpilli of Texcoco selected Moctezuma Xocoyotzin to be the next emperor. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, 9th tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. The day after Ahuitzotl's ashes were interred in the sacred precinct, a council was formed to select the next ruler. There were many choices, and after some discussion, all the lords there unanimously selected Moctezuma the Younger. Born around 1468, Moctezuma was the son of tlatoani Axayacat, nephew of previous tlatoque Tizoc and Ahuitzotl, and also a noted military leader and religiously devout man. He had served as tlatoque or military general, the highest rank in the Mexica world, and it was said his military advice was always sound. He was a natural choice. During a coronation ceremony likely held in 1502, retold in detail by Duran, the new king vowed to care for the people of Tenochtitlan, including the old, the young, the gods, and warriors. How accurate Duran's writings are is not clear, but the scene he sets is one of a powerful oath taken to his people. One of his first moves was to replace most of the heads of state his uncle Ahuitzotl had appointed across the empire. He contended many were commoners, and it was unbecoming of the empire to not have nobles in place. Traditional views about the role of nobility would be a hallmark of his rule, making him a sort of Aztec conservative with religion and tradition being central to his core beliefs. Moctezuma's reign from his coronation until the arrival of Cortez was like the previous rulers. He spent time marching the army to various rebellions and wars. His inaugural war was against Nopalan in the southern state of Oaxaca. This land had already been conquered, but its people rebelled, and Moctezuma marched to put them down and collect sacrificial victims for his coronation festivities. Moctezuma returned from the Pacific coast with sacrifices for his festival. Invites were sent, preparations were made, and on the chosen day, guests from across the empire began to arrive. There was dancing, music, and sacrifices, of course. The festivities were well received by all guests, and soon they left, impressed by the new king's wealth and status. During his reign, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin went to war against Tlaxcala, Huechotzinco, and numerous other campaigns back to Oaxaca. The Catholic sources begin to detail a series of omens, a comet, a strange bird, a two-headed man. All of these supposedly foretold the coming of Cortez. Some of the Catholic sources also indicate that the indigenous people thought Cortés was Quetzalcoatl returning to fulfill a prophecy. Today, historians and modern storytellers reject these as Catholic narrative building. His arrival was, however, one of the biggest moments in human history. The arrival of the Spanish. Cortés was the third Spanish captain to show up on the Mexican coast and the second to speak to the local Aztec leaders. Captain Grijalva met Aztecs the year before Cortés in 1518. Moctezuma had received reports of these strangers for at least a year before he met Cortés on that fateful day in the streets of Tenochtitlan. There are many opinions on the handling of the Spanish by Moctezuma. It seems he chose a path of political appeasement, which ended up leading Cortés into the heart of his capital. Soon the Spanish seized Moctezuma and moved him to their quarters, the palace of his father, the former ruler Xocoyotzin. On one fateful night, while Cortés was away from the city, the Spanish committed a brutal attack on the people of Tenochtitlan who were celebrating the Tenochtitlan festival. The core of Mexica nobility and military leadership was eliminated in one savage event. When Cortés returned, now with 900 fresh troops and 80 horses, Moctezuma tried to put the massacre behind them by hosting a feast for Cortés. This did not go over well with the traumatized populace. Cortés continued to hold him in the palace until his death, most likely caused by the Spanish, but often cited as the victim of a stone cast by his countrymen in protest to his perceived weakness. There was certainly that sentiment at the time among the Mexica, who could not understand the continued entertainment of these violent men by their king. But in losing power over his countrymen, Moctezuma would also have lost value to Cortés. Whether by a stone to the head or a knife to the ribs, or whatever manner he died, the story of what happened to his body also has many varying accounts. One account says Moctezuma's corpse was wrapped in cloth and left in the corner of the palace, found on the Noche Triste after the Spanish had snuck out. Another tells how Moctezuma's own nobles carried the body out to the people, which triggered the revolt. Others say the body was unceremoniously dumped in a canal by the Spanish and found by the Mexica. At least one account says his body was recovered and cremated in the manner of all Mexica rulers. It seems to me that Moctezuma died in a state of real and perceived weakness, held captive in his own city, unwilling to encourage violence against the Spanish. Today, Moctezuma is the most well-known of the Aztecs. Americans joke about Montezuma's revenge when they invariably get sick on vacations to Mexico, invoking the ghost of an angry lord. Sadly, this context was my own introduction to the Aztecs. I understood it was a joke, but the idea of a displaced king cursing the descendants of his conquerors stayed in my imagination. Moctezuma was a noble man of intelligence and dignity, but history fated him for one of its greatest demises. In his life, he was an accomplished military captain, a devout religious man, and a respected member of the nobility, and he should be remembered as such. The empire was in a state of collapse when Moctezuma died. Invaders occupying the capital, disease spreading, allies turning on them, and an army weakening by the day. On June 30th, 1520, the Spanish left the city on what would become known as the Noche Triste, or to indigenous folks, La Noche Victoriosa, as this was one of the few victories the Mexica and their allies would ever get over the Spanish. With their capital back in their possession, the Mexica began to recover from the violent occupation and massacre, but a new disease was taking hold, smallpox, and a new leader was needed. In the next episode, we cover the post-contact rulers of Tenochtitlan, including one of the most famous, Cuauhtémoc. Thank you for listening, and for more information on the history of the Mexica or the conquest, visit mexicapodcast.com. Thank you.